Now let's move on to today's perspective. And this month has seen protesters smashing windows of banks in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. The Lebanese lira has lost about 97% of its value. More than 80% of people are now living below the poverty line. And it is a phenomenon that it's feared could spread. In Egypt now, the pound has halved in value against the dollar. Urban inflation is at nearly 26%, food prices up 50%. Egypt is not at Lebanon's level yet, but many observers say the warning signs are there and there's little sign of things picking up. Well, we're going to talk about that in perspective today. And with me is Timothy Kaldas, who's a policy fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Thanks for joining us on the programme today. Lots of similarities are being drawn between that situation in Lebanon that we've reported on very widely here on France 24 and Egypt. Do you think they're fair?
Well, I think that obviously the situation in both countries is quite dire, but the circumstances in Egypt are more manageable, at least for the time being, than those in Lebanon. Egypt has a much more diversified economy and more sources of external financing currently than Lebanon does, and that helps prevent kind of this level of deterioration that we're witnessing in Lebanon today. Additionally, there is a government to negotiate with. One of the challenges for Lebanon in terms of getting a bailout or an IMF deal is that they haven't been able to form a government in quite some time. And the acting government has very limited authority, which complicates the situation even further. And finally, frankly, Egypt is a country of over 100 million people, which intensifies the interest of a lot of its bilateral partners to prevent something similar happening. The unfortunate thing for Lebanon is I think that their bilateral partners are more willing to tolerate this deterioration there than in Egypt.
How bad has the deterioration been for individual people? What has it actually meant to them?
In Egypt, there's undoubtedly an intensification of poverty. A lot of Egyptians were already vulnerable before the pandemic started, never mind the invasion of Ukraine and this latest financial crisis. In 2019, the World Bank had estimated that 60% of Egyptians were living near or below the poverty line. I think it would be reasonable to assume that number has significantly increased since then. And food inflation in particular has been incredibly intense for people. Last month it approached 40%, and it just keeps getting worse. I think additionally, the government has not been able to secure sufficient access to dollars, to hard currency, which has complicated their ability to implement some of the reforms demanded by the IMF, particularly the flotation of the Egyptian pound, and that has prevented them from unlocking other potential sources of financing like Gulf investments.
I mean, from your second answer, it sounds quite a desperate situation, but from your first answer, you still seem fairly optimistic about the eventual outcome.
I'm not optimistic. I'm less pessimistic, I think is the honest answer. Look, both situations are very bad. The situation in Lebanon is uniquely devastating, whereas in Egypt it's bad, but for now at least potentially manageable. It's just a different order of magnitude in terms of the number of variables that are kind of leading to Lebanon's deterioration. But that doesn't mean that Egypt's doing well or has positive prospects. Quite the contrary. Many of the drivers of growth in Egypt are at risk of coming under pressure to slow down this year. The public sector is supposed to rein in investments in a lot of infrastructure projects that have been a major driver of growth in the last several years. Simultaneously, the private sector has been shrinking for much of the last 7 years, so the odds of them filling in the gap are low. There's going to be a lot of pain and difficulty in Egypt as well. It's just not likely to reach the scale of what we see in Lebanon. It's just an issue of grades and degrees.
Whose fault is it then?
I mean, largely, first and foremost, it's the fault of the regime that has, over the last several years, leveraged the state to engage in an array of poorly studied, poorly planned, and poorly executed infrastructure projects and mega projects that have been used as a vehicle for their own enrichment and their own empowerment. But additionally, the IMF and their shareholders have been watching this happen and continue to provide financing and access to credit that has allowed for this predatory leveraging of the Egyptian state to persist. And a number of the shareholders have enriched themselves. I mean, France, for example, between 2012 and 2021, according to the French parliament, they have received 12.3 billion euros in arms orders from the Egyptian government alone, which is nearly the equivalent of the EU's entire 12.6 billion euros of orders in the same time. The Germans as well, in 2021, 46% of their arms exports went to Egypt in a record-breaking year for arms exports in Germany. So you have a situation where Egypt has been running up a credit card it can't afford, and a lot of its bilateral partners and institutions have helped them gain access to that credit and watch them use that money in a very reckless fashion. Although at certain points, it was in their interest because they were benefiting financially as well.
So what do you think needs to happen at this stage where we are at the moment in order to reverse all these problems then?
I think fundamentally the newest IMF program actually finally begins to, for the first time, it mentions the military-owned companies. It mentions the importance of reining them in. I think what needs to be seen is an appetite for actually enforcing those conditions in particular, and trying to move Egypt to a place where the military doesn't have this predatory position vis-a-vis the state and the private sector, and is pressed to really pull back. That's a really important thing. Social protection in Egypt needs to be expanded significantly. The IMF and World Bank over the last several years has been pushing Egypt to switch from subsidy support to targeted cash transfers. And the trouble is that the number of beneficiaries in Egypt from those targeted cash transfers is only, at this point, roughly 20 million people, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, at least 60 million people were vulnerable in 2019 before things got this bad. So clearly, leaving tens of millions of people without the necessary support is untenable and is also damaging for domestic demand and the prospects of private sector growth. So that needs to be addressed as soon as humanly possible. Additionally, we need to see more transparency in terms of the way the government spends its money and accountability over the contracts that are being doled out. A lot of the contracts that went to the military and to regime-owned enterprises were direct orders, so they weren't competitive bids. They weren't getting the best price per se. And finally, with the sale of assets that the government is pursuing to help raise financing, it needs to be done in a transparent and competitive way as well, as opposed to these kind of backroom deals with Gulf states. It needs to be done in a way where everybody has an opportunity to bid and we can see those bids. And finally, we need to make sure that that money actually goes to the state.
And if that can be done, sorry to interrupt you, but if that can be done, how long would it be, do you think, before individual people start noticing a difference?
It'll still take years, unfortunately.
I don't know if you heard me there. I said if that were to be done, how long would it be before individuals noticed a difference?
Unfortunately, it will still take years. I don't think there's any immediate relief coming.
Good to talk to you today on the programme. Thanks very much for joining us, Timothy Kaldas, who's a policy fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy.
My pleasure.
Thanks once again.